Well, I'm very pleased to receive nice words, especially from someone like tonight's chairman. I should remind Alan that there are two things that I never tell people. One is I went to a private school, and secondly, the Australian newspaper said something nice about me once. But thank you anyway. My job is actually a bit like an auctioneer. It's always getting the first bid that is difficult. But I'm going to make it easy for you. So this part of the session is really about you, not about us. But I'm going to make it easy for you by, in about 3 minutes, bringing it all together. And then you can just pick up on any aspect of it. But Justine mentioned the moral and ethical challenge that we all face, which is to take the Paris Agreement above and beyond. And that raises the advocacy issue, and that raises the depression that we all have at the moment because we feel that the political context in which we raise our children and our grandchildren seem to be destroying those great values of the 70s, by which some of us at this table have held on to for the last 40 years or so. But also in terms of the advocacy issue, His Honour also raised the economic issue and also the legal duties issue, which is, and so when I say the economic issue, I say that solar power and wind power and other renewable energies are creating jobs and driving industry and employing people, and they're doing it so well that governments now have to offer to subsidise railway lines to coal mines so that banks might think about financing the coal mine so that the railway line will actually have somewhere to go. And there's the legal danger to all of those people that they may be left holding other people's babies and being sued for the stranded assets. Talking of our babies, I spoke to one pregnant woman tonight, and one of our speakers has just delivered herself of a baby, but in 2100, somebody born in 2017 will turn 83, and some of the people at this table, including myself, are not that far away from being 83 years old. So the children and the grandchildren issue does bring the threat of anthropogenic climate change very realistically to us, because we are in fact talking, some of us, about our children and some of us of our grandchildren living through much of this. Which brings me back to the advocacy issue, and somebody said to me the other day that doom and gloom is not a great way to persuade people because we all switch off. And so amongst the doom and gloom of our Prime Minister and the American President, we have to remind ourselves of what our speakers said tonight, that there are subnational states like California and progressive governments like the new Canadian government and the responsible governments in Europe, all of whom have been taking these issues forward, and some of whom will continue to take it forward, even as solar and wind and other things are becoming cheaper and legal. And even Saudi Arabia, for example, is investing in large amounts of solar energy and photovoltaic cells. So amongst the doom and gloom and the political context that we tend to worry about every day, there are a lot of underlying momentum that is carrying us forward. And another point I want to make with regard to that is there is a difference between states. I heard somebody talking about this in diplomatic terms, but Prime Ministers come and go, but the state is still obligated to talk about the Paris Agreement and talk about its achievements. And Steve Bannon might want to blow up governments, but not too many people in Australia want to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because there's so much shame that goes with it. And so there will still be public servants doing things which push forward and try to achieve our targets and change our policies and make it easier for cities and local governments and state governments to push things forward to combat climate change, which comes back to two things, advocacy and public interest litigation in the environmental field. Are we being persuasive, I say to the EDO, in bringing an action in the Land Court against Adani? Should we be bringing it in the Supreme Court and suing all of the directors? What is the most effective public interest litigation which is going to persuade governments and persuade public servants and persuade politicians over the next 10 or 15 years? That's questions for us to ask ourselves. What's the most persuasive way of using our the other anthropo money that we have in order to bring climate change litigation? Maybe it is just to sue the directors. And that should make it pretty easy for you. That brings it all together. So, who is my first bid? If I have two questions or two comments, everybody will want to jump in the game, but who's going to be that first person?
Thanks everyone for your speeches. They were very enlightening tonight. This might be more of a comment or maybe an invitation to comment. I understand overnight there was a decision in the South African High Court that considered decided that the government did not appropriately consider the climate change impacts of a proposed coal-fired power station. It was primarily decided on the obligations within their local statute to consider all of the environmental impacts of a proposal, and the proposal in their environmental impact statement didn't include quantification of climate change greenhouse gas emissions. And the court was found that that was in breach of the legislation, decided it would be returned to the government to be redecided. But one of the things that was interesting in the judgment was that it had regard to the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention on Climate Change as reinforcing the interpretation that it was an environmental impact that needed to be taken into account, even though the local legislation didn't specifically identify climate change as an impact. So it was one of these more normative changes that Justice Preston referred to, that I think it starts to get picked up in judgments and local interpretation. It was also fascinating in that decision that had regard to the Bill of Rights, which, like most modern democracies, includes the right to a healthy environment. And it was again decided that that was a interpretive factor that favoured taking into account climate change impacts. So I think it sort of fits in with that model of the Agenda case and the Lahore case in Pakistan, and increasingly the decisions we're seeing in Australia, that wave of climate change litigation, that even though the INDCs in the Paris Agreement may not have binding effect, it supports that groundswell of litigation. And hopefully we'll see more of that in some of the cases and the decisions that are pending for my office. But I wonder if any of the speakers tonight had an opportunity to read that decision, had any further comments to make on it.
I'm not going to bring the speakers in straight away. I want 4 or 5 comments and questions, and then I'll bring the speakers in at the end to deal with which ones they find the most interesting. Can I just add one other thing? So it's a competition now. The other thing that I think emerges from both presentations tonight, that education and expertise and knowledge of climate change issues and climate change obligations and other legal obligations are really important to our institutions, whether they be local government, whether they be state financial institutions, whether they be the public service generally. And it's not just lawyers, it's accountants and a lot of other professions which I think are important to be aware of these issues, because through the mechanisms that have been discussed tonight, you can influence the institutions in which you work and make them aware of the dangers of being sued as directors or being subject to other penalties if you don't act and know about climate change. Can we have another comment or question, please? Yes, Robert.
Robert Quirk, Queensland Bar. The doctor's presentation had a graph on it which indicated that, I think it was for $2.5 billion in one of the funds, a certain level of emissions could be reduced. Extrapolating that out to, say, I think you say about $40 billion, it looked like then that could be a figure that we would achieve compliance with our requirements. What's the practicality of achieving it that way?
She's taken it on board.
Oh, sorry, did you want me to answer that now?
No, I'll get you to come in. Yes, in the front here.
Eugene, what's my name?
Here we go, Eugene.
In terms of discussions, quite obviously we're talking a bit beyond law. Justine before... No? Oh, okay. Justine mentioned about science and such, and Stephen just said the same thing. My question is, or to raise, is in a world now where we seem to be getting anti-science, the new government in the United States seems to be going that way, and we have people say that we shouldn't have vaccinations because, you know, shop owners and senators say it rather than having actual medical people say it. How do you counter the fact that this discussion about science and education is in fact not actually a plus in resolving the issues that we're talking about tonight?
Good question. A couple more. Yes, in the middle there. There's one to your left.
My question is, given that the government is very keen on stopping organisations like the EDO taking cases to court to try and stop climate spoiling developments, do you think that we're going to be able to stave the new legislation to stop environmental activism, or can you give some suggestions as to how we can keep the activism going in very difficult circumstances?
Well, generalising that question, are we seeing the end of democracy in the Western world? Another question? That's in the middle there again, behind Eugene.
We have the complexity of legal and also the political class and their inaction. Just a very simple question. What do we think of an ice-free world? Now, it sounds a simple question, but all the ice, the 2 poles and the 3rd pole, which is all our glaciers, once all that goes, what happens then? Who asks that question? Because that has an impact on ocean circulation, albedo, and a whole range of... It's a very simple question, but when the ice goes, what happens to the world then?
Okay, now I'm going to add one more question, and then I'm going to bring the speakers in. I was actually inspired by the judge's statement with regard to the difficulty of proving scientifically the relationship between particular disaster and the level of climate change. I have an idea that when people talk about the fact that that can't be shown, when they do talk about it, whether it's possible to say, well, a bushfire like this or a cyclone like this would have occurred 40 years ago, once every 100 years, but now you're going to have one of these every 5 or 10 years. That, I think, does assist that advocacy issue with regard to that inability to point to that causing that. If we can say that mightn't have caused that, but it made it a lot more likely, it may help in that advocacy. Are we going to keep the same order? Justine, would you like to go first? I think it's best if you come up here.
Okay, sure.
And set them to it. I think Alan will say you've got 3 minutes to answer all of those questions.
That's okay. All right, I hope I've written enough notes here. Firstly, Sean's comment about the South African case, I definitely have not read that. But I think that's really interesting, the fact that the Paris Agreement is now being mentioned in court cases, so I'm definitely going to have a look at that. And I think, as I was saying, it really is up to country parties to take Paris and run with it domestically, so that's really heartening to hear that's happening through the judiciary. Answering the question about the emissions reduction fund, so the $2.55 billion that was allocated to that. So I think the figure I showed said that could purchase 14% of what Australia pledged by 2030, and I think it was 7.5% of what would be needed to stay within 2 degrees, so quite short of what would be needed for Australia to actually do what it said. And your maths is better than mine, so you extrapolated that out to about $40 billion that we'd need the federal government to invest in order to reach that? And is that a good way to go about doing things? I don't really know if that's for me to answer. I don't know if the ERF, even at the current level it's funded at, is really the best way to go about doing things. I think there's been a lot said about the previous government's carbon pollution reduction scheme and the idea of polluters being the ones to pay for reducing emissions versus this new situation where we've got the federal government effectively paying for it with tax dollars. Whether we increase that level of tax dollars going into it, I probably don't think that's the way to be going about it. So it really just comes down to this question of what is the best way to be funding emissions reductions. And certainly this system that is pretty heavily criticised at the moment, extrapolating that out, I think would be fairly unpopular. The next question was about science and denialism of science in the context of climate science and this really interesting vaccination debate that we're back to again this week in the media. Look, as I said, I think Paris is actually a bit of a triumph in that regard, in that we do have a target that is really firmly grounded in science and really pinned to what has happened through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process. So, if we compare the Kyoto Protocol, as I said, that 5% target, it was great, it was black and white, but it really bore no resemblance to what scientists were necessarily saying we needed to do. So I think the fact that we do have an agreement that's really heavily grounded in science now is really good. And I know a lot of my colleagues in science certainly think that that's a really positive feature of the Paris Agreement. So look, getting public to accept science, I think, is a huge battle that we're still unfortunately fighting in a lot of different avenues. But just purely looking at Paris, I think that's done a really, really good job of picking up the science, even if it was slightly dated science. The question about environmental activism, I might defer to the judge to deal with that. It's probably a little bit out of my comfort area. The question about melting ice. So what will we do if there's no ice? Look, if there's no ice at all, I think we're all pretty much stuffed. So we probably don't really need to worry about that. We're going to see some ice melting, though, certainly under the current business as usual projections, or even if we stay within 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And I certainly can't put a figure on that off the top of my head, but we are going to see a certain amount happening. And the impacts of that are going to be huge. So sea level rise is the area that I'm most familiar with. And I was talking a little bit about the Pacific Island countries that are really, fighting not just for their coal industries, but for sovereignty and their citizens. And they're the sort of countries that are going to be really heavily impacted by that. So that's something we really do need to be thinking about as well. And I think that's a kind of roundabout way of getting to your question. But if we had no ice at all, it would be catastrophic. And finally, Stephen's comment was about... Oh, you don't want me to answer that?
I just think we do need to wind up. Yep.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm happy to... It was a tricky question anyway, so I'm happy to dodge that. So I'll pass over
Brian,
to the
would you
judge
like
then.
to have yours 3 minutes?
Although, very quickly on that. Good example, Sean. Thank you for that, and I think it really did fit nicely with what I've been was endeavouring to say. So thank you. In relation to the anti-science, alternative fact, alternative universe that we're entering, all I can say is that courts, the process of adjudication proceeds with an explicit rationality. There's a reasoning process that always must be applied. There's a sort of judicial method, but I won't go into that. And it's evidence-based. So that adjudication is based upon the evidence that's put before the court and that alone. And that evidence, there are rules which govern its reliability and its credibility. So the manner in which courts determine litigation is quite different to how there is the political discourse that can be done in 140 characters or less. And so I just think we've got nothing to worry about, because they're just once it goes to court, it goes through a particular rational and evidence-based approach, and the court will determine it accordingly. The question about the causal connection with particular weather events, don't have much more than other than I said, we don't get that out of the Paris Agreement, we don't get it out of the IPCC reports or the even the Framework Convention. That's not to say that you can't use some of the evidence and statements there as a step in a chain of reasoning along the lines, Stephen, that you're talking about. You may do. All I was simply trying to make is that I was trying to see what effect the Paris Agreement has on that, and I was just saying you won't get that specific causal connection out of that Paris Agreement.
We come to the end of the evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've been very quiet, but I do want to make one comment. One of the joys of retirement, and I retired 2 years ago, is the opportunity to follow your obsessions. So I get up about 6 each morning and see what President Trump has has sent out that evening. My present hope, and you might share it, is that somebody sometime is going to alert him to the existence of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he's going to blame not the Chinese government but a Vogon constructor fleet for the problems that we presently face. Can I remind you of one other EDO function that you might enjoy, as you won't learn as much as you will tonight, but you will hear a debate around the topic "The End is Nigh," in which three boomer folk, some of us who might take the blame for our present predicament, will argue that the end is not nigh, and that team includes Justice Glenn Martin, Peter Stilgo and me, and three younger folk who will argue the positive. And there will be an art auction. It's on the 5th of May, 6:30 p.m. at Law Society House. If I can sum up the really remarkable presentations we've heard tonight, it seems to me from Dr. Bell James that we have a clear and justifiable cause for concern, and from Justice Preston that lawyers can save us, but there's a lot of work to be done. Could you please join with me in thanking Dr. Bell James, Justice Preston and Stephen Keim